Welcome to this explainer. Tonight, we're going to look at a scenario that is the absolute stuff of nightmares. Picture this, all right? It's the dead of night on July 7th, 2017 at San Francisco International Airport. You've got 4 passenger planes lined up on a taxiway, engines humming, just patiently waiting for their turn to take off. Suddenly, the pilots in those waiting aircraft notice something that shouldn't be possible. A massive commercial airliner isn't heading for the actual runway, it is hurtling rapidly out of the night sky, coming straight at them. Today, we're breaking down the chilling story of Air Canada Flight 759, which is an incident that came within a single solitary second of becoming the most catastrophic disaster in aviation history.
Okay, let's dive right into the staggering number. Over 1,000. That's the number of human lives sitting inside those 4 waiting planes on the ground. We're talking about 3 fully loaded United Airlines jets and 1 Philippine Airlines jet. All of them are packed with passengers, and crucially, all of them are topped up with highly flammable jet fuel for their upcoming flights. They are completely stationary, literally just sitting ducks on a dark taxiway.
And hurtling right toward those stationary planes is Air Canada Flight 759. This is an Airbus A320 arriving from Toronto Pearson after a long 5.5-hour journey. On board, you have 135 passengers and 5 crew members. Now, the flight had been completely routine. The pilots, highly experienced. They'd landed at San Francisco plenty of times before. But as they drop out of the night sky, they are completely oblivious to the fact that they're aiming their massive aircraft directly at a crowded taxiway instead of the runway.
Part 1. Setting the trap and the visual illusion.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how exactly 2 highly experienced pilots managed to fly a modern airliner onto a direct collision course with a taxiway. Well, to understand this, we have to look at their fatal misconception. See, San Francisco has 4 runways, but due to the wind direction that night, only 2 parallel runways were being used for landing, runway 28 left and runway 28 right. Because these pilots had landed here before, they expected to look out their window and see 2 parallel strips of lights. But here is exactly where the trap snaps shut. Runway 28 left was closed for maintenance, so its lights were completely shut off. Instead, the pilots looked down and saw 2 lit paths, runway 28 right, and right next to it, the green lit taxiway. In the dark, they assumed the lit runway was 28 left and the green taxiway was 28 right.
To put that into perspective, think about this number, 100 meters. That is the only distance separating runway 28 right from the taxiway. Just 100 meters. At the sheer speed a commercial jet approaches, that is a microscopic visual margin. Because they misidentified those strips of lights, Air Canada 759 deliberately aligned itself 100 meters to the right of where it should have been. It was a tiny visual miscalculation that set up a massive, unprecedented catastrophe.
Part 2. 3 fatal pilot mistakes, the cascade of errors.
You know, aviation is built entirely on redundancies to catch these kinds of things. But on this night, a compounding chain of errors completely shattered those safeguards. Here's the cascade of failure. First, as we just saw, they visually misidentified the green taxiway lights as runway lights. Second, they missed the critical pre-flight paperwork that explicitly warned them runway 28 left was closed. And third, despite having the technology right in front of them to confirm their exact alignment, they failed to activate their instrument guidance system. Let's actually zero in on that second mistake, NOTAMs, or Notices to Air Missions. This is essentially a dense printout of vital flight updates, covering everything from takeoff to landing. The closure of runway 28 left was right there in the paperwork. But if you know anything about NOTAMs, you know they can be like finding a needle in a haystack. We're talking pages and pages of mundane information. It is dangerously easy to miss one specific note, and that night, the Air Canada pilots completely glossed over the fact that a major runway would be dark.
And then we have the technology failure. The control tower gave Air Canada clearance for a visual approach, which basically means they have to rely on their eyes to line up the plane. Because visual approaches can be tricky, especially with noise abatement procedures at SFO requiring planes to come in slightly from the right to avoid flying directly over the city, pilots typically use their instrument guidance system as a fail-safe backup. But on this specific Airbus A320, the system required manual activation by literally typing in the runway number. For whatever reason, the pilots just didn't do it. They flew blind, completely trusting a flawed visual illusion.
So the crucial point underlying all of this is 19. Why were these incredibly experienced pilots making such fundamental rookie errors? Well, it was 11:05 p.m., and they had been awake for 19 straight hours without any significant rest. They were deeply fatigued. And at the time, Canadian aviation regulations regarding pilot fatigue were simply not as strict as the rules down in the US. Their judgment and their situational awareness were severely impaired at the exact moment they needed them most.
Part 3. Seconds from disaster. The final moments. And this brilliantly illustrates how fast things went wrong. We're back in the cockpit. The plane is rapidly descending. The landing gear is down. 135 passengers are buckled in, expecting a perfectly smooth arrival. But below them, the pilots in those waiting planes suddenly realize what's happening. The Philippine Airlines crew actually flips on their landing lights to illuminate themselves as a desperate warning. Up in the Air Canada pilots see these lights on what they think is the runway, and they feel something is off. They quickly radio air traffic control to check. ATC replies. And then an anonymous United pilot on the ground jumps onto the radio, leading to a frantic last-second order.
Listen to this terrifying disconnect. When Air Canada radioed the tower, the lone controller on duty looked at his radar, saw the runway was clear, and confidently replied, "There is no one on 28R and it is completely empty. You have permission to land." But what the overworked solo controller didn't realize was that the plane on his screen wasn't aimed at 28R at all. Because it was late at night and traffic was light, there was no separate ground controller monitoring the taxiways. The tower essentially just gave Air Canada permission to land directly on top of 4 fully loaded planes.
Then comes the miracle. An anonymous pilot from the United jet sitting directly in the path of the incoming plane keys his mic and screams to the tower about the plane aiming for the taxiway. The tower instantly yells for Air Canada to go around. The Air Canada pilots shove the throttles forward and pull back hard. They clear the first 2 planes, and as they struggle to gain altitude, they pass mere feet above the 3rd waiting United plane. Just feet! If there had been a single second of delay, literally 1 second of hesitation, it would have been the most devastating fireball in the history of commercial flight.
Part 4. The Aftermath and New Rules.
They pulled up, they circled around, and eventually landed safely. But the aviation industry doesn't just walk away from a near miss of this magnitude. The National Transportation Safety Board launched a massive investigation. Their findings firmly placed the fault on the Air Canada pilots for missing the NOTAMs and completely ignoring their instrument guidance. But the system itself had to change too. SFO implemented strict new rules. If a parallel runway is closed, visual approaches are banned entirely. You absolutely have to use instrument guidance. Furthermore, they mandated that a dedicated ground traffic controller must be present in the tower at all times, even during quiet, off-peak hours, just to ensure someone is always watching the taxiways. Which brings us to our final thought today. The rules have definitely changed, and the safeguards are absolutely stronger. But at its core, this terrifying night in San Francisco shows us that when fatigue sets in, even the most experienced, highly trained humans will misinterpret the world right in front of their very eyes. It took a flashing light from a parked plane and a split-second warning from an anonymous pilot to prevent the unthinkable. So I leave you with this. If systemic safety ultimately relies on human perfection, how close are we really to the next impossible disaster? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.